It was early springtime when the strike was on. They drove us miners out of doors, out from the houses that the company owned. We moved into tents up at old Ludlow. I was worried bad about my children, soldiers guarding the railroad bridge. Every once in a while, a bullet would fly, kick up gravel under my feet. We were so afraid you would kill our children. We dug us a cave that was 7 foot deep, carried our young ones and pregnant women down inside the cave to sleep. This is Woodie, Guthrie, Ludlow Massacre, 1946. And I got three questions for you. How many kids were killed at the Ludlow Massacre? What was the larger war that the Ludlow Massacre was a part of? And what were the two sides that were pitted against each other? You had the Union versus the corporation. What was the name of the Union? What was the name of the corporation? And if you want to name the owner of the corporation for bonus points, or some of the Union leaders, that's too much. You know too much if you know the Union leaders of the Ludlow Massacre. That very night, your soldiers waited until all us miners were asleep. You snuck around our little tent town, soaked our tents with your kerosene. You struck a match, and in the blaze that started, you pulled the triggers of your Gatling guns. I made a run for the children, but the firewall stopped me. 13 children died from your guns. I'd carried my blanket to a wire fence corner, watched the fire till the blaze died down. I helped some people drag their belongings while your bullets killed us all around. I will never forget the look on the faces of the men and women that awful day when we stood around to preach their funerals and lay the corpses of the dead away. We told the Colorado governor to call the president, tell him to call off his National Guard. But the National Guard belonged to the governor, so he didn't try very hard. Our women from Trinidad, they hauled some potatoes up to Walsenburg in a little cart. They sold their potatoes and brought some guns back, and they put a gun in every hand. The state soldiers jumped us in a wire fence corners. They did not know we had these guns, and the redneck miners mowed down some of these troopers. You should have seen those poor boys run. We took some cement and walled that cave up where you killed these 13 children inside. I said, God bless the Mine Workers Union. And then I hung my head and cried. Remembered Ludlow, Julia May Courtney. So, should we listen to these next two things? Yes. Yes, but first I'll go ahead and answer the questions. He said 13 were killed by the guns, but the fire, 21 kids is what, 12 to 21 kids. So, I guess we only know a range. From 12 to up to 21 kids. 8 adults were all killed, and 1 bystander were killed on that day, which was April 20th, 4/20, 1914. That's when the Ludlow Massacre had happened. Now, Tikas, Filer, and Larson, those are some of the Union leaders. John D. Rockefeller Jr. John D. Rockefeller Jr. is going to be the owner of the CFI. CFI is the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company Corporation. Corporation Colorado Fuel and Iron. John D. Rockefeller Jr. So that's on one side. And the United Mine Workers on the other side. Even though you're going to have, a bunch of kids and bystander and adults, and they had maybe 3 or 4 people that were killed during the Ludlow Massacre. But the war actually lasted from September 1913 to April 29th, 1914. And there were nearly 70 to 200 people that were killed. It's called the deadliest strike in U.S. history. So it wasn't just that one day. It lasted over 6 months. And the Ludlow Massacre was a part of the Colorado Coalfield War. The Colorado Coalfield War. So you had the war in the Colorado Coalfield. You had a war. The Ludlow Massacre was all about that war. So Ludlow Massacre was just one day of that war that happened. And then there was a retaliation. And it's actually kind of exciting. It sucks to always be the victim in history, but there was a retaliation after Ludlow Massacre. That's why the war didn't end the 20th. They say it ended the 29th. So the war continued for another 9 days. The war had already been fought for 6 months prior to the Ludlow Massacre. Let's read some of Julia May Courtney. Remember Ludlow, May 1914. That was during the Progressive Era, too. Remember Ludlow, the battle cry of the crushed, downtrodden, despised miners stifled at Calumet in West Virginia and Cripple Creek has echoed from coal camp to coal camp in southern Colorado and has served again to notify the world that labor will not go down. Peaceful Colorado, slumbering in her eternal sunshine, has been rudely awakened, and her comfortable citizens, tremendously busy with their infinitely important little affairs, have been shocked into a mental state wavering between terror and hysteria. And the terrified and hysterical community, like the individual, has grabbed for safety at the nearest straw. The federal troops are called to the strike zone in the vain hope that their presence would intimidate the striking miners into submission. And the first spasm of the acute attack has subsided, but the end is not yet. In September, the coal miners in the southern Colorado district went out to strike. Immediately, the word went forth from number 26 Broadway, the Rockefeller headquarters in New York City, and the gun thugs and the gunmen of the Phelps Baldwin Agency were shipped from the Virginia and Texas fields and sent by the hundreds into the coal camps. So a bunch of private mercenaries, private security guys, Phelps Baldwin. So that's what the war was against, a bunch of local Coloradans versus a bunch of private security mercenary details, outsiders. Sent by the hundreds into the coal camps with their wives and children, the miners were evicted from their huts on the company's ground, and just as the heavy winter of the mountains settled down, the strikers put up their tents and prepared for the long siege. It was then that the perennial weak-kneed Governor Elias Ammons, phoning on the representatives of the coal companies at the request of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, called out the militia to keep order. So the governor of Colorado was on the side of the corporation and the mercenaries and the private security detail from out of Virginia and Texas. Oh, a bunch of Virginia, Texas, mercenaries are here killing a bunch of Coloradans. And the climax came when the first spring winds blew over the hills and the snows melted from the mountainsides. On the 20th of April, the cry was heard. Remember Ludlow, the battle cry that every working man in Colorado and in America will not forget. For on that day, the men of the tent colony were shot in the back by soft-nosed bullets, and their women and children were offered in burning sacrifice on the field of Ludlow. The militia had trained the machine guns on the miners' tent colony. At a ball game on Sunday between two teams of strikers, the militia interfered, preventing the game. The miners resented, and the militia, with a sneer and a laugh, fired the machine guns directly into the tents, knowing at the time that the strikers' wives and children were in them. Charging the camp, they fired the two largest buildings, the strikers' stores, and going from tent to tent, poured oil on the flimsy structures, setting fire to them. From the blazing tents rushed the women and children, only to be beaten back into the fire by the rain of bullets from the militia. The men rushed to the assistance of their families, and as they did so, they were dropped as the whirling messengers of death sped surely to the mark. Louis Ticus, leader of the Greek colony, fell a victim to the mine guards' fiendishness, being first clubbed and then shot in the back while he was their prisoner. 52 bullets riddled his body. Louis Ticus. Into the cellars, the pits of hell under their blazing tents, crept the women and children, less fearful of the smoke and flames than of the nameless horror of the spitting bullets. One man counted the bodies of 9 little children taken from one ashy pit, their tiny fingers burned away as they held to the edge in their struggle to escape. As the smoking ruins disclosed the charred and suffocated bodies of the victims of the Holocaust, thugs in state uniforms hacked at the lifeless forms, in some instances nearly cutting off heads and limbs to show their contempt for the strikers. In state uniform. So that's the National Guard protecting the nation. 55 women and children perished in the fire of Ludlow tent colony. Relief parties carrying the Red Cross flag were driven back by the gunmen. For 24 hours, the bodies lay crisping in the ashes while rescuers vainly tried to cross the firing line. The militiamen and gunmen laughed when the miners petitioned Czar Chase, General John Chase, and Governor Ammons for the right to erect their homes and live in them. For the first time in the history of the labor war in America, the people are with the strikers. They glory in their success. The trained men have refused to carry the militia. Entire companies of the National Guard have mutinied. Nearly every union in the state has offered funds and support of men in arms to the strikers, and the governor has asked for federal troops. The federal troops are here. The women who forced the governor to ask for them believe they have secured peace, but it's a dead hope, for peace can never be built on the foundation of greed and oppression. And the federal troops cannot change the system. Only the strikers can do that. And though they may lay down their arms for a time, they will always remember Ludlow. The labor troubadour Joe Hill was executed by the state of Utah on November 19th, 1915, accused of murdering 2 shopkeepers. 5 years earlier, while working on the docks of California, Joe Hill met members of the IWW and became an active wobbly. Soon, his humorous and biting political songs like The Preacher and the Slave were being sung on picket lines across the country. From his jail cell in Utah, Hill wrote to Big Bill Haywood in a telegram, "Don't waste time mourning, organize," a line that became a slogan of the U.S. labor movement. Don't waste time mourning, organize. On the eve of his execution, Joe Hill penned these words, "My last will, November 18th, 1915. My will is easy to decide, for there is nothing to divide. My kin don't need to fuss and moan. Moss does not cling to rolling stone. My body, oh, if I could choose, I would want to ashes it reduce and let the merry breezes blow my dust to where some flowers grow. Perhaps some fading flower then would come to life and bloom again. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you." Joe Hill. Joe Hill.